certain politicians, and obviously the media has painted this horrible picture about what the drug is as opposed to what it truly is. What are what's some of the misinformation you've seen with the media especially, and how they've painted hydroxychloroquine to the public?
Yeah, I just cannot believe that we're even talking about its safety profile. I don't know how to stress this any more than saying it's got a better safety profile than Tylenol and aspirin. It's over the counter in most of the world. It's very safe. So every time I hear anybody talking about the safety issue, I know that they've drunk the political Kool-Aid. And I want to appeal to you as a physician, stop. There is no safety issue. Look at the FDA database. Look at the CDC website. Look at the American Heart Association report on this. No safety issue whatsoever. You want to talk efficacy? Let's do it. I'll stand with that as well. But that's the biggest concern, that there's a safety issue.
What have you seen when you prescribe hydroxychloroquine to a person who is COVID positive? What is usually what follows after that? How does it usually go down after they get prescribed hydroxychloroquine and start taking it? What happens to their symptoms, and how quick does that turnaround happen?
So I don't use hydroxychloroquine early on in healthy younger people, just because they tend to recover just fine. But if there comes a moment that I choose to use it because a person does have shortness of breath or significant fever or chest pain, it is remarkable. There's tons of YouTube testimonials about this. I'm sure you've seen it. It's as close to a magic bullet as I've ever seen in my 20 years of practicing as an emergency physician. So every time I've used it, patients have improved typically within hours, and I mean less than 24 hours, certainly within 48 hours, but most patients, even 12 to 24 hours, have noticed an improvement. It is dramatic. The trick with hydroxychloroquine is to give it early. That doesn't mean you have to panic like the moment you get a little bit sick. There's a big range kind of early, probably 7 days or 8, 9, even 10 days. But if you do it early, the turnaround is dramatic.
And in a recent video, we've spoken about how hydroxychloroquine is readily available in Africa as well. It just seems to be people carry it around on them all the time. It's no big deal. Maybe talk about a little bit about the history of hydroxychloroquine and where did it get this bad image? I know the media has been had played a role in that. Why has hydroxychloroquine gotten this tinge on its name, and what can we do to kind of raise some awareness about what really is going on with hydroxychloroquine?
Yeah, so everyone should do a Google search of hydroxychloroquine and look up articles before March 2020 or January 2020. There was absolutely no controversy around this drug. It's been FDA approved for 65 years. We give it to pregnant women, breastfeeding women. We give it to children. We give it to immune-compromised patients. We give it to the elderly. We give it to healthy patients. The FDA maintains a database of what's called serious adverse events, where they track any serious adverse events every year. They've been doing this for about 50 years. So they've tracked hydroxychloroquine serious adverse events. And the last 50 years, there have been 57 serious adverse events, resulting in 10 fatalities linked to hydroxychloroquine and that heart problem they talk about. That's in 50 years. Now, the FDA gets 1 million serious adverse events a year, and there's been 57 in 50 years related to hydroxychloroquine in the heart. So the short answer is there's zero controversy in terms of the safety. Tons of data to support that. It's only a media fiction that there's controversy.
If we weren't able to get hydroxychloroquine over the counter, what do you think would change right away? And what would that look like when it comes to the projections of how bad COVID could be going forward?
The truth is, Austin, this is a crime against humanity. This is happening all over the world, and America needs to take a leadership role and stop the countries like ours that are limiting hydroxychloroquine. It's killing people not to have access. I spoke with a friend yesterday in Indonesia, and I'm going to share with your viewers. I asked him to snap a photo in his pharmacy, and he just literally went down the street. It's just sitting there on the counter. It's a really safe drug. We have a lot of drugs over the counter that are not nearly as safe. Motrin, Tylenol, aspirin, they all come to mind. The leading cause of needing a liver transplant in our country is a Tylenol toxic reaction. Every single week in the emergency department, I see people who have GI bleeding from Motrin, aspirin linked to GI bleeding. These are over-the-counter medications. Chloroquine is much safer than those. So how are we not getting this into the hands of the American people? I don't understand. And I hope to be able to have the opportunity to ask the president to make it, and through videos like yours, just share with the people. They need to be clamoring for this. This is a life-saving medication that's extremely safe. It would change everything. It would change everything. And this is just not my word for it. I'm quoting Dr. Harvey Risch was a professor extraordinary of epidemiology at Yale School of Public Health. He has almost 40,000 citations on Google Scholar. And I interviewed him this week, and he said that if we had had a liberal hydroxychloroquine policy, we would have saved half to 3/4 of the people who've already died. That's something around 70 to 100,000 of the people who've died wouldn't have died. What he does as an epidemiologist is he studies the data and the health implications of that data. So hydroxychloroquine is really so effective that lots and lots of people wouldn't have had to die. We also can see that when we look at the correlation between countries where it's easily available and countries where it's difficult. I'll tell you a very interesting story. France took a really hardline position on hydroxychloroquine. There's a lot of political reason why, there's no medical reason for it. But the famous professor who I think you've heard of, Dr. Didier Raoult, who did some of the landmark initial studies with it, he was allowed to continue using hydroxychloroquine as trials, but they were not allowed to use it in the rest of France. So his data versus the rest of France is extraordinary. So they called him into their equivalent of Congress to kind of do an inquiry how it was, and he just demolished them. In Marseille, where he's from, and his patients in his hospitals, the death rate of patients who got very sick with COVID was 0.5%. The rest of France, or around the Paris area, was over 19%. So again, their Congress, their Assembly, heard this information, and it caused a tremendous firestorm. And the result of that firestorm was not that Dr. Raoult got in trouble, but rather the Prime Minister and the Health French Minister are now being investigated. The Health Minister needed to resign. And this doesn't even really make it into the American press. So I'm sharing all this because the tide is turning. This is happening all over the world. Countries that were strictly limiting hydroxychloroquine cannot stop the tsunami of positive evidence that it works well. And it's all coming out. And I look forward to Americans just getting better much more quickly. And I look forward to Americans letting go of the fear. When people know that they have a pill in their pocket that they can take, it changes everything. Obviously, some people won't want to take it right away or may feel they don't need to take it. But there's a lot of people that if they knew they had that pill, would just go about their lives. And all of a sudden, the fear would be gone, lockdowns would end, schools would open, and that's what we need to do. There's only two things to think about when you think about medications, right? Is it safe and does it work? That's it. So we're going to put the does it work on the back burner for a moment, because does it work is not really a question for making it over the counter, right? It needs to be over the counter if it's safe. We can address the does it work in a moment. Let's talk safety. This has been FDA approved for 65 years. As I mentioned, the FDA maintains a database where it had almost no serious adverse events. In addition, it's been specifically studied in the COVID era multiple times. So they studied it with azithromycin because the concern was that the two together, the antibiotic azithromycin together, could do this little heart electrical problem called a QT prolongation, and if it did, it could be a problem. Well, that question has been definitively answered by the American Heart Association. They published it's absolutely safe, not a problem. Your viewers can go right now, another source, the CDC website. People who are traveling to malaria endemic regions often take hydroxychloroquine, and right now the CDC website says it's safe. Anyone can take it, children, older people, no problem. You could take it indefinitely. There's literally no restriction. The people who prescribe hydroxychloroquine most in our country are rheumatologists, right? They prescribe it to patients for years and often decades. They have a ton of experience with it. On their website, they don't even recommend, any special monitoring of the heart. There is zero question that hydroxychloroquine is safe, and it's much safer than many over-the-counter drugs that we use routinely. Once we accept that it's safe, the question is, does it work? It was clear to me as a physician that it worked, but now, as an early adopter kind of physician, but now that the data is rolling in, it's clear, it should be clear to all physicians who read the studies. We all heard about the Detroit study where it cut mortality in half. The most amazing thing about that, Fleccas, is that that was in later use. It works incredibly well early in the disease process. So it works in the later for a different mechanism, but the result is more modest. But in the beginning, it's pretty much a cure. And I've been reluctant to say that because there's been so much, politicization of the drug. But, I looked up the definition of cure yesterday. I mean, it's a cure. I don't know what else you can call a cure.
Do you think if hydroxychloroquine was more readily available, we would avoid things like lockdowns and mask requirements?
Yeah, so 100%. You probably noticed I don't speak publicly about masks, and the reason is when patients or people ask you about masks, honestly, Fleccas, what they're asking you is an existential philosophical question: am I going to be okay? Right? It comes from a place of fear. There's really no way to dislodge that except by walking through your fear. There's no factual basis to be as anxious as people are, but they've been fed a lot of misinformation, so they are anxious. So I don't really talk about the masks. What I want to do is just treat people's fear. And the moment people know that if they were to get this disease or any disease, that there is a treatment for it, their entire attitude will change. Some people have said to me, well, you can't change overnight. And I say to them, this is like everything else in life. There's 5 groups of people. There's innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. Everyone is divided into these 5. There's people that do things really early, like that's the first guy to get it. There's people who are pretty early. There's the majority of us that are kind of in the middle, and there's people that adopt things very late. All right, this is how society works. So if hydroxychloroquine was over the counter, there's going to be some people right away, yeah, I'm on board, I love it, I've been following it, it's great. There's going to be a lot of people in the middle who are like, let me just see how it goes. And there's people like, not me, right? What's gone wrong here is we need to let the innovators and the early adopters, those people in society that do things earlier, let them do their thing, let them get comfortable. The middle people will watch and see how it goes. They'll see it's fine and they'll jump on board. That's, if you think about it, how everything goes in life. You know, electric cars are like that, right? There's always people who do things earlier, people who do things middle, people who do things late. Let's do it with hydroxychloroquine.
Interesting. And if it were to go over the counter, what would need to happen? Would that be an executive order from Trump? Is that something that's possible? And then what would it look like right after? What do you think would be the result if we went over the counter with it right away?
Yeah, well, we're consulting with some lawyers now to see what the best actual mechanism is to make that happen. What I know as a physician is that we need to get this drug in the hands of the people. When you look at graphs of countries where hydroxychloroquine is widely available compared to countries where it's not available, the results are startling. You know, if you've got hydroxychloroquine available in your country, the mortality rate is like this, and if you don't have it, the mortality rate is like this. It's quite dramatic. That means that countries that are first world countries or wealthier countries or democracies, very often those are the countries where it's very difficult to get. Isn't that interesting? So like the UK and the Netherlands and Belgium, France, United States, the death rates are much higher than in other countries where it's widely available, such as Kazakhstan. I would say most of Asia, most of Africa, most of South America, Latin America. It really isn't over the counter here, only because there was no push from the pharmaceutical company to bring it over the counter. Drugs go from prescription to over the counter because there's a profit motive for the pharmaceutical company to do so. So for example, Aleve or naproxen went over the counter when the manufacturer decided they could make more money selling it over the counter. So they petitioned the FDA for that. The thing with hydroxychloroquine is there's not a lot of general usage for it, so there's not a lot of demand. So if it was over the counter, it would just sit on the shelf. So nobody ever pushed for it. And that's really, I think, why it's not been over the counter here.
If it were to become readily available, it sounds like it would be pretty cheap as well. Can you kind of touch on how it's not as expensive as maybe the other alternatives that people are pushing?
You know, you always have to wonder about the money trail, like, you know, show me the money. You know, why hydroxychloroquine is not already over the counter long before COVID really has to do with money. And I don't criticize anyone for that. There just was no demand for it, so the manufacturer didn't bring it over the counter. That's cool, all right? But there's no real cost to this drug. It's a generic drug, it's safe. It actually happens that we have a national stockpile ready to go of 63 million dosages. I'm speculating, but it's, you know, $10, $15 for the whole thing, the whole shebang. You know, remdesivir, which is being touted as a effective medication, which there's a lot of detail in that statement, a lot more that needs to be investigated, but it's about $3,500 a treatment dose, and all of those remdesivir supplies have already been sold and purchased by our government. In other words, the manufacturer of remdesivir already sold it for $3,500 times whatever the output is, millions, I don't know, of patients. What I do know is we have 63 million dosages of hydroxychloroquine ready to go for really cheap, probably $10 or $15 a treatment.
So yeah, when it comes to the prescribing of hydroxychloroquine versus the potential over-the-counter use, if over-the-counter is not possible, what do you think about the off-label use of it?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. You know, once drugs are approved by the FDA, any physician can prescribe for any reason at all. Physicians are constrained by their personal and professional obligations to do the right thing for the patient, and also by tons of regulations and, of course, fear of medical malpractice. So there's no concern with that statement that they can use it for any use. The FDA exists to make sure a drug that's on the market is safe. Once it's known to be safe, it's approved, and then we use it. So this is super interesting. A drug can be approved for one usage, but used for another. And when it's used for another, it's called off-label. I'll give you a great example. There's a drug called Zofran. A lot of you viewers may have heard of it. We use it all the time for nausea. When I say all the time, we call it the bacon of drugs. Like, it goes with everything. Anyone who comes in with a stomach ache or nausea, anything, essentially gets Zofran. As a little aside, it prolongs your QT interval, by the way. But really, everyone gets Zofran. And yet, the on-label indications for Zofran are only post-operative and associated with chemotherapy. But we give it all the time for gastritis or gastroenteritis or stomach flu, or if you're hungover. I mean, we give it all the time. It's a drug I use every single day, and yet its off-label usage is rampant. So it turns out doctors prescribe off-label about 21% of the time. You know another drug that's off-label all the time? Morphine is not approved for pain medication for children. It's just not approved for pain medication. There's plenty of famous examples. Aspirin is not on label to use for coronary artery disease, which everyone knows people with heart disease take aspirin, right? Patients with heart disease who have diabetes or other high-risk situations, it's not approved. It's used off-label. Like, in other words, it's used all the time off-label. So the patients or the public think off-label maybe sounds like something, but to a physician is absolutely nothing. We never think in terms of something's on-label or off-label. On-label just means that the drug went through a particular process with the FDA to get approved for it, and that if the drug had to go through a process for a different diagnosis, it's really expensive and time-consuming, so manufacturers basically don't do it once the drug is out there. So it's a complete myth to agonize and worry about on-label or off-label. So when this whole thing happened, we're like, okay, well, we'll just use hydroxychloroquine off-label. Like, who cares? That's fine. What happened is the government has started putting its regulatory powers over doctors and saying you can't use it off-label. Now, the interesting thing is that's not true. We use off-label all the time, and there's no special law that says just for COVID we should act differently. I had the pleasure of running into Dr. Birx about a week ago, the Coronavirus Task Force Committee, and I asked her this question. I said, doctors as a practical matter are having a lot of trouble prescribing hydroxychloroquine. By the way, I get texts and emails every single day from patients desperate for the medicine all the time. So I said, what can we do about that? And she said, well, of course you can still prescribe it off-label, no problem. I said, no, but it's really a problem. She said, no, just prescribe it off-label. So there, the disconnect between what's actually happening and what people think is happening, like policymakers, is really vast. But there's no rule that says you can't prescribe something off-label. However, because there's been so much misinformation around this issue, I just think it would be great if we had clarity from the federal government that it's perfectly okay to use hydroxychloroquine over the off-label, just like we do with any FDA-approved medication.
Absolutely, and a lot of this comes down to a potential executive order, it sounds like. So what would your message be to President Trump, if you could tell him one thing directly regarding that potential executive order to make hydroxychloroquine over the counter?
Right, so, the FDA is under the executive branch, and I'm very concerned about this as a physician, and I would plead with the president to really consider doing this. And the reason is that it's not going to be possible through the traditional channels. Normally, a drug would be petitioned by the manufacturer. The manufacturer would petition the drug to become over-the-counter, but there's no impetus to do that, and there's a lot of political reasons not to do that. And I feel like there's been, let's just say, obfuscation or corruption at so many levels that it's just not going to happen any other way. And day after day, American citizens and American people are dying. So if the president doesn't do it, we're just going to continue on this very negative path. I think all about the scientific journals that were corrupted. That the media doesn't report on the positive messaging from hydroxychloroquine. I think you know that the state governors have been very, really abusive towards physicians who want to prescribe it. And even the federal government through the FDA has written or made statements that hydroxychloroquine isn't effective or you can only use it in a clinical trial. Those are both completely false. There's a lawsuit against the FDA right now for saying such things. But to reverse all this, to reverse the state governors and the medical boards, and to reverse the media misinformation to the people will take months and months. We can't wait that long.